They say history doesn't repeat, it only whispers. But in 2027, the whisper is turning into a warning siren, a signal that the American financial system, once the strongest in the world, is accelerating toward a moment that future textbooks will call one of the most radical redistributions of wealth ever attempted. A process not by accident, but by design. A process wrapped in legality, justified by crisis, and ultimately executed through a single stroke of presidential authority. A new executive order that will reshape who owns what in America. To understand how a modern government can seize wealth without ever touching your bank account directly, we need to step back, not just months, but decades, into the slow construction of a system built on debt, data, and dependence. A system that was designed to function beautifully in times of growth, but becomes predatory the moment the economy slows. A system that, in 2027, finally reaches its breaking point. It begins on a quiet morning inside the Treasury Department. Markets are volatile. Interest payments on the national debt have crossed a threshold no administration can politically defend, and global creditors are demanding answers. The dollar is weakening. Foreign central banks are selling. And inside Washington, there is one question dominating every meeting. What happens when the world no longer wants America's IOUs? The answer, as unthinkable as it sounds, is what drives the executive order. The American government cannot allow a default, not politically, not globally, not militarily. So instead, it chooses a different path. It decides to control the crisis rather than be consumed by it. And controlling the crisis means controlling the money. The new executive order, still unknown to the public, is drafted under the language of national economic stabilization. The wording is vague on purpose. A future emergency must look like destiny, not choice. Inside its text are powers that will allow the Treasury, the IRS, and the Federal Reserve to coordinate in ways never seen before. It authorizes account conversions. It authorizes forced auditing. It authorizes the movement of certain strategically sensitive assets into federal oversight. And most importantly, it authorizes the introduction of a new form of government-issued digital money. But this is not just a story about digital currency. The executive order is the culmination of a decades-long shift, one in which private wealth has become necessary collateral for a government that can no longer sustain itself. For years, the warning signs were visible: rising deficits, unfunded liabilities, a debt-to-GDP ratio crossing levels once associated with collapsing empires. The government spent more money than it created real value. The system survived only because someone, somewhere, was always willing to buy U.S. debt. In 2027, that changes. Americans first sense something different in the air long before the executive order becomes public. Banks quietly shorten their hours. Wealthy families move assets offshore. Corporations repatriate liquidity. Something is wrong, but no one can articulate it. The media runs stories about global uncertainty, blaming everything from foreign conflicts to supply chain disruptions. But beneath the noise, there's a simple truth. The era of unlimited borrowing is ending, and the government needs a new way to fund itself. Historically, governments in crisis take three actions. They tax wealth, they devalue currency, or they seize assets. In 2027, America doesn't choose one. It chooses all three, just wrapped in language that makes it sound like financial modernization. The first step is the liquidity freeze. It begins with a simple announcement from the Federal Reserve: temporary capital flow adjustments. A phrase carefully designed to avoid panic. But what it really means is that large transfers above a certain limit require approval. Most Americans don't notice, but investors, corporations, and high net worth individuals do. The panic starts at the top. At the same time, the IRS begins deploying new monitoring systems, quietly funded years earlier under the banner of closing the tax gap. For the first time, every transaction over a few $100s is analyzed in real time. Patterns are tracked, accounts are flagged. Funds that used to move freely now move through digital checkpoints. Citizens feel nothing at first, but the infrastructure is in place. The infrastructure needed for what comes next. The executive order is finally signed on a Friday afternoon. That is not an accident. Governments always announce major financial actions when markets are closed. The document itself is short, only a few pages, but what it triggers is massive. It authorizes the launch of a new national digital dollar, one that is programmable, traceable, and fully controlled by the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. It mandates that certain high-risk assets must be reported, revalued, and in some cases, converted. The public reaction is confusion. Politicians claim it's modernization. Experts call it necessary, but the truth is darker. The government has found a way to move the wealth of a nation without ever breaking the law. It begins subtly. Retirement accounts are transitioned into the new system under the justification of protecting Americans from market volatility. Bank accounts above a threshold require registration. Brokerage firms must report holdings daily, not quarterly. The language frames it as safety, as shielding citizens from uncertainty. But the real purpose is control. The moment wealth becomes digital, programmable, and centrally tracked, it becomes movable. And then comes the conversion process. People wake up one morning to find notifications from their banks. Some accounts have been labeled as priority conversion classes, eligible for the new digital dollar program. For most citizens, nothing changes except the balance format. But for the upper 5%, the system behaves differently. They receive notices that certain assets must be transferred into government-regulated custodial accounts. They are told the assets are not being seized, only secured. But securing is the first step to possession. The government frames it as a patriotic duty, explaining that the nation must stabilize its financial system, that the digital dollar will reduce fraud, increase transparency, and protect Americans from global economic shocks. But internally, the objective is clear. Funnel private wealth into a centralized system where it can support the collapsing public balance sheet. This is not the first time America has done something like this. In 1933, the government seized private gold under Executive Order 6102. In 1971, it closed the gold window, ending convertibility and trapping global creditors in a debased currency. In 2008, it bailed out banks instead of depositors. In 2020, it locked down the economy while injecting trillions into asset markets. Every crisis creates a legal pathway for the government to take more control. And every time, the public accepts it because the alternative seems worse. But the 2027 executive order is different in one crucial way. It uses technology to execute what previous administrations could only dream of. For the first time, the government does not need to send agents to seize assets. It does not need to knock on doors. It does not need to convince a single billionaire to cooperate. The wealth is already digital. It already moves through monitored channels. And with the new currency system, it can be redirected instantly, invisibly, algorithmically. Certain industries feel the shock first. Real estate developers watch as property valuations come under government review. Energy companies face new compliance rules. Cryptocurrency exchanges are ordered to freeze transfers until further guidance. Americans who believed digital assets meant freedom realize too late it also means visibility. The executive order expands week by week. It introduces incentives for citizens to adopt the new system, tax credits, discounts, expedited services. But these incentives slowly turn into requirements. Federal payments, Social Security, pensions, refunds, begin to be issued exclusively in the new digital dollar. Eventually, opting out becomes impossible. This shift enables the final stage of the wealth seizure, revaluation. When the government controls the currency, it controls the value of everything priced in that currency. All it takes is an algorithmic adjustment, a stabilization calibration, and wealth can evaporate or grow on command. Large asset holders realize this too late. Their accounts are revalued based on risk weighting. Their digital dollars cannot be transferred out of the country. Their portfolios are placed under temporary state oversight. The public doesn't revolt, they don't protest in the streets, because the government presents the crisis as a patriotic mission, a national fight for economic survival. Citizens feel the anxiety, but they also feel the promise of safety. A system controlled by the government sounds comforting in chaos. And by the time people realize what they've surrendered, the new system has replaced the old one entirely. The shockwaves spread quietly at first. Most Americans still go about their daily routines, unaware that the rules governing their wealth have fundamentally changed. But beneath the surface, every institution is adjusting to the new reality. Banks begin restructuring their internal systems, preparing for full integration with the government's digital network. Financial advisors whisper to clients that traditional strategies no longer apply. And in private meetings across Wall Street, anger brews, but no one knows where to direct it. The executive order has removed the illusion of independence. Banks now act as extensions of federal policy. Investment firms comply with reporting requirements that would have seemed unimaginable just years earlier. And those who try to resist discover that resistance is now considered a risk to national security. Every financial interaction, from the largest corporate trade to the smallest personal transfer, leaves a digital footprint that feeds a central algorithm designed to evaluate, categorize, and classify all economic behavior. The government assures the public that these systems are intended to prevent fraud and protect citizens. But the true purpose is far more sweeping, to create a perfect map of the nation's wealth, down to the last dollar, the last asset, the last transaction. For decades, such a map was impossible. Cash was private. Assets were hidden. Offshore accounts provided shelter. But the 2027 digital dollar changes all of that. Privacy becomes data. Data becomes liability. And liability becomes leverage. Foreign governments watch closely. Some accuse the United States of authoritarian overreach. Others quietly admire the strategy. A few even begin developing their own versions of the system. But the world's investors panic. Capital begins fleeing U.S. markets, not because of distrust in American power, but because of the unprecedented consolidation of that power. For the first time in modern history, private wealth is no longer safe from state intervention, not even in America. The Treasury responds by imposing new rules on capital outflows. Corporations are banned from moving funds overseas without federal approval. High net worth individuals attempting to transfer assets abroad are flagged for review. Companies with global operations complain loudly, but they have no choice. Their liquidity depends on access to the new digital system. Without it, they cannot pay employees, issue payroll, or settle trades. Compliance becomes survival. Meanwhile, the public is bombarded with messaging that paints the executive order as a patriotic evolution. Government officials appear on television explaining that the old financial system was outdated, vulnerable, too dependent on foreign creditors, and too susceptible to crisis. They say the digital dollar will create stability and equality. They say it will eliminate financial crime. They say it will empower the middle class. The narrative is polished, persuasive, and repeated around the clock. Many believe it. Many want to believe it. After years of inflation, instability, layoffs, and uncertainty, Americans crave the promise of order. A system that can be controlled by the government feels safer than a chaotic global market. People don't realize that stability and control are two very different things, and that one often comes at the cost of the other. In private, federal agencies begin executing the most controversial provision of the executive order, the Strategic Asset Realignment Program. It sounds harmless, even technical. But behind those words is the mechanism for the largest wealth transfer in American history. Assets deemed systemically important can be temporarily appropriated, reorganized, or reassigned to support national financial stability. Real estate, commodities, corporate shares, and even certain forms of intellectual property fall under this authority. Corporations are the first to feel the impact. Companies in technology, energy, and infrastructure receive notices that the government will be taking a minority stake. Not permanently, officials claim, but until conditions normalize. These stakes provide the government not only financial leverage, but voting rights. Overnight, strategic industries become partially nationalized. CEOs protest quietly, but comply publicly. Then the program expands. Millions of Americans receive letters informing them that specific assets, real estate holdings, investment accounts, even family businesses, have been flagged as high risk and must undergo a government valuation. The language is carefully chosen. Cooperation is required, not optional. The process is described as protective, not intrusive. But every valuation gives the government the opportunity to determine whether an asset must be pledged, converted, or restructured for national stability. At first, only the wealthy are affected. But the definition of wealthy shifts each month. What began as a threshold for the top 1% soon becomes the top 10%, then the top 20%. Ordinary families who spent decades saving for retirement suddenly find themselves in the same category as corporations. Their portfolios are reviewed, their properties assessed, their financial decisions monitored. What shocks many Americans is not the government's power, but how easily it is accepted by institutions. Banks cooperate. Tech companies integrate digital ID systems without protest. Payment apps link directly to federal databases. Loyalty to the customer becomes loyalty to policy. Meanwhile, the digital dollar evolves. What began as a modernization tool now becomes programmable. The government introduces features that allow money to be time-limited, restricted, or incentivized. Certain digital dollars expire if not used within a specific period. Others can only be spent on approved goods or in approved regions. Citizens receive stimulus boosts that nudge them toward specific behaviors, spending in one sector, avoiding another. This is sold as economic optimization, a way to guide the nation through the crisis. But programmable money has another purpose: to control demand. If the government can control what money can buy, it can control the economy itself. It can direct consumption, restrict savings, and nudge public behavior. Freedom becomes something defined not by law, but by code. As the year progresses, tension rises. People begin noticing unusual changes. Accounts freeze temporarily for routine compliance checks. Transactions are reversed without explanation. Some individuals discover their digital dollars are categorized into different classes, some more valuable, some less. Questions grow louder. Is the government creating a tiered money system? Are certain groups being penalized? Officials deny it, but the evidence grows. The wealthiest Americans face the harshest restrictions. Their digital dollars are locked behind stability protocols, meaning they cannot freely move or convert them. Large withdrawals trigger automatic audits. Attempts to liquidate assets require approval. Those who complain are told their wealth poses a systemic risk, that their actions could destabilize the economy. The rich discover something the poor have known for years. The system does not care about fairness. It cares about control. Offshore financial centers become overwhelmed as Americans attempt to bypass the system. But global cooperation, once unthinkable, becomes reality. Foreign banks comply with U.S. demands for transparency. Nations that once served as shelters now reject American clients, fearing retaliation. The world closes its doors, leaving citizens with no escape route. Quietly, the government begins the second phase of the wealth seizure: consolidation. Pension funds are merged into a national retirement system. Private healthcare accounts are integrated into federal digital wallets. Insurance companies are required to back their reserves with government bonds, effectively converting private savings into public financing. Step by step, the lines between private and public wealth blur until they are indistinguishable. The public senses something is wrong but can't articulate it. Daily life still functions. Stores remain open. Paychecks arrive on time. But the feeling of autonomy begins to fade. People notice the rules changing without warning. Digital dollar wallets display messages reminding users of spending guidelines. Financial decisions that were once simple, buying stocks, moving funds, withdrawing cash, now trigger warning pop-ups requesting justification. The loss of freedom is not a sudden event. It is a gradual erosion, a slow tightening, a recalibration of expectations. People adjust, they accept, they adapt. A new slogan emerges: for the security of all. It appears on government websites, advertisements, even billboards. It frames the digital system as a collective effort. Citizens are told their compliance protects the nation from collapse. Resistance, therefore, becomes unpatriotic. The narrative is effective. Many embrace it. Some celebrate it. But a growing minority feels trapped. And then the tipping point arrives. One morning, Americans awake to headlines announcing the National Stabilization Reserve, a new institution created under the executive order. Its purpose is simple: to manage strategic assets pledged through the realignment program. But the announcement reveals a truth that shocks even those who supported the system. The reserve now controls nearly a third of all private financial assets in America. Stocks, bonds, properties, businesses, all held in trust by the federal government, all justified as temporary, all without a single act of Congress. This is the moment people realize that the wealth seizure is no longer theoretical. It has already happened. The announcement of the National Stabilization Reserve sends a chill across the country. Not because people fully understand what it means, but because for the first time, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Private wealth has been absorbed into an institution that no one voted for, no one debated, and no one can challenge. It is presented as temporary, yet history shows that temporary government powers almost never return to the people. In the first hours after the announcement, the stock market reacts violently. Trading screens flicker as investors attempt to dump shares in industries now partially controlled by the government. But sell orders fail, transfers bounce. Brokerage apps display a message: pending authorization. It takes only minutes for traders to understand that the markets they once navigated freely no longer belong to them. Price movements become irrelevant when ownership itself is regulated. The government steps in with calming language. Officials appear on camera assuring Americans that nothing has changed, that the stabilization reserve is simply a protective structure, a financial shield designed to prevent collapse. They insist the system is not nationalization, but stewardship. They emphasize stability, safety, and order. And for many people, this reassurance works. Fear gives way to acceptance. The illusion of normalcy is restored. But beneath the surface, something far more significant is unfolding. The stabilization reserve begins issuing directives to corporations, instructing them on hiring practices, resource allocation, even pricing strategies. A subtle but unmistakable shift occurs. Economic decisions, once determined by markets, are replaced by decisions determined by policy. CEOs become managers. Investors become spectators. Entrepreneurs become license holders. The government's silent takeover is complete. At the same time, the digital dollar reaches full adoption. All remaining cash transactions above small thresholds are phased out. Banks remove ATM machines, explaining that the new system no longer requires physical withdrawals. Some citizens protest, arguing that cash is freedom. But the government counters by saying cash is untraceable, unsafe, and used for crime. Within months, the last meaningful sanctuary from digital monitoring disappears. Americans begin to notice the world shrinking around them. Their financial lives are confined within a borderless, invisible structure built from code. Every purchase, every payment, every transfer routes through the same federal network. It is efficient, it is fast, it is total. Then the wealth scoring system appears. One morning, citizens open their digital wallets and find a new number displayed prominently beside their balance. a rating based on financial stability, spending patterns, and contribution to the national system. Officially, it is designed to optimize economic behavior and reward responsible financial activity. But the implications are clear. A low score restricts access to certain benefits. A high score unlocks privileges. People begin altering their spending not by choice but by necessity. The algorithm becomes their financial conscience. The reserve expands again. It announces a set of recovery bonds, claiming citizens can support the nation by voluntarily locking a portion of their digital dollars into long-term commitments. The bonds pay minimal interest, but participation is framed as patriotic. What the public doesn't realize is that these bonds are not voluntary for everyone. The system begins automatically allocating portions of wealthier individuals' accounts into the program. The justification? Stabilization. Those who protest find their accounts temporarily frozen for security review. And then, the most controversial measure is unveiled. The government reveals that the stabilization reserve will now set annual wealth responsibility targets. This means certain Americans must contribute a percentage of their assets into the national pool. It is not called a tax. It is not called confiscation. It is framed as a civic responsibility, a shared sacrifice necessary for national healing. But everyone understands what it truly is, a legalized siphoning of private wealth into state-controlled reserves. The top 1% is hit first, then the top 10%. Later, anyone with holdings above the middle-class threshold is included. Each year, the threshold lowers. What began as a program targeting the ultra-rich becomes a mechanism impacting ordinary families who spent their entire lives saving, investing, and planning for a future that suddenly no longer belongs to them. Despite these measures, the government insists the system is temporary, that once the crisis ends, freedom will return. But there is no timeline, no milestones, no definition of what ending the crisis even means. The system becomes self-justifying. It continues because it exists, and it exists because it continues. Meanwhile, a quiet resistance grows. Small groups of Americans begin searching for alternatives, barter networks, physical commodities, and encrypted private exchanges. But the government monitors unusual purchasing patterns and flags suspicious activity. The digital dollar's code can detect attempts to bypass the system. Participants are warned. Some are penalized. Others simply vanish from the financial grid, rendered invisible by account freezes that leave them unable to pay bills, buy necessities, or participate in daily life. It becomes clear that the digital economy is not just a tool of control, it is the boundary between survival and exclusion. Some states attempt to challenge federal authority, arguing that the executive order exceeded constitutional limits. But the Supreme Court rules in favor of the government, citing national security concerns. State-level resistance collapses. The financial system is now unified, but unified under total federal jurisdiction. As the year progresses, people grow accustomed to the system. They adapt their behavior to maintain their wealth scores. They accept restrictions as normal. They adjust to a life where money does not fully belong to them. And the government, having successfully absorbed the nation's economic core, begins focusing on the final stage of the transformation. The Reserve announces a plan to restructure national debt using consolidated private assets as collateral. The move is unprecedented, a merging of public obligations with private wealth. Economists warn that the government now has the power to erase or reassign wealth simply by adjusting its debt strategy. But the public barely understands the implications. By this point, fatigue outweighs concern. Soon after, the government implements a stability adjustment, a recalibration that changes the value of certain asset classes. Real estate is devalued by double digits. Stock portfolios are rebalanced according to risk tier. Digital dollars and high-risk accounts undergo harmonization, reducing their value to align with national stability metrics. Overnight, millions of Americans see their net worth shrink, not because of market failure, but because of a federal algorithm. Shock turns to anger, anger turns to fear, but fear meets a system designed to absorb it. Protests are restricted by digital perimeter controls. Large gatherings trigger automatic account audits. Leaders of resistance movements find their wealth scores drop, which restricts their mobility, purchasing power, and communication tools. This is the moment Americans realize the full power of programmable money, not as a convenience, but as a weapon. Yet even in this environment, the human desire for autonomy persists. A growing underground network forms, composed of former bankers, coders, old libertarians, young idealists, small business owners, and everyday citizens who refuse to accept a nation where wealth is no longer personal. They begin developing decentralized systems, encrypted tools, and alternative stores of value. They operate in the shadows, knowing exposure means financial erasure. As the government tightens control, these underground systems grow more sophisticated. A silent financial civil war begins, one fought not with weapons, but with code, secrecy, and defiance. The government responds by strengthening the executive order once more. It expands surveillance. It criminalizes unauthorized digital activity. It deploys AI-driven enforcement. Every financial move becomes a battlefield. Every purchase becomes a decision with consequences. Citizens begin living in two worlds at once, the official system that governs their lives and the hidden system that preserves their freedom. And then something unexpected happens. International markets begin losing confidence in America's new model. Foreign nations fear that if the U.S. can seize wealth so easily, it may eventually seize foreign-held assets as well. Capital flees, investment dries up, the dollar, once strengthened by control, weakens from isolation. The system built to stabilize America begins destabilizing it from within. The government faces a crisis of legitimacy. In response, the Stabilization Reserve unveils its final act. It announces a plan to convert the digital dollar into a global-ready currency, backed not by gold or productivity, but by the consolidated wealth of the American people. This, officials claim, will restore global confidence. But the public understands the truth. Their wealth is no longer theirs. It has become the backbone of a system they never asked for. The executive order changed everything, but history is still unwritten. And the question that defines America's future is simple. When wealth becomes permission, who decides what freedom means? The answer, one way or another, will shape the destiny of the United States long after 2027.